The sun had just begun its slow ascent over the Hawaiian horizon on December 7, 1941, casting golden streaks across the calm waters of Pearl Harbor. A gentle breeze carried the salty tang of the Pacific, ruffling the uniforms of sailors as they went about their routines. The harbor, normally bustling with the controlled chaos of ships preparing for maneuvers, appeared almost serene that morning. Lieutenant James Harrington, a man in his early 30s with a neatly trimmed mustache and eyes accustomed to the rhythm of naval life, made his rounds aboard the USS Arizona. The battleship's steel deck gleamed in the morning light, rivets and polished rails reflecting a day that, for all appearances, would be ordinary. Harrington paused near the bow, watching as a small group of sailors hoisted the American flag with practiced precision. Their laughter and easy banter echoed across the water, creating a comforting sense of routine. Beyond the harbor, the island itself was stirring. Honolulu's streets were beginning to fill with vendors setting up stalls, the aroma of fresh coffee mingling with the scent of warm bread from bakeries. Children ran barefoot along the shoreline, their joyful shouts mingling with the gentle slap of waves against the docks. In the cafes lining the streets, men read newspapers, oblivious to the storm that history was about to thrust upon them. Across the harbor, Lieutenant Harrington noticed the silhouettes of other battleships, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, and USS Nevada, all perfectly aligned like a fleet of silent sentinels awaiting orders. Crewmen polished brass fittings and scrubbed decks, a ritualistic preparation for the unknown. Though whispers of unrest in the Pacific had reached the ears of intelligence officers, there was no tangible sense of immediate danger. The threat felt distant, almost academic, like a weather report forecasting storms that might never come. As Harrington walked the deck, he exchanged nods with Petty Officer Daniels, a wiry man with a quick smile, who was inspecting the gun turrets. "Another Sunday like any other," Daniels remarked, squinting at the horizon. Harrington nodded, though a subtle tension crept into his chest, a feeling he could not quite shake. Reports of Japanese naval activity had circulated in the past weeks, but the scale and intent remained unclear. He reminded himself that rumors often carried more weight than reality, and for now, the sun rose over Pearl Harbor, indifferent to the concerns of men below. Below deck, engineers were conducting routine maintenance. The hum of machinery, the rhythmic pounding of hammers, and the hiss of steam created a background of industrious energy. Sailors joked and shared stories, their voices mixing with the mechanical symphony, unaware that within hours this ordinary soundscape would be replaced by chaos and destruction. Harrington descended into the engine room briefly, exchanging a few words with Chief Engineer Thompson, a veteran whose calm demeanor inspired confidence. "Nothing like a quiet morning to keep the nerves steady," Thompson said, wiping sweat from his brow. Harrington smiled, but the uneasy premonition in his mind remained. On the shore, life mirrored the calm aboard the ships. Families enjoyed leisurely breakfasts in wooden homes painted in pastel colors, children chasing chickens in backyards, and neighbors greeting one another warmly. Honolulu's streets hummed with the soft rhythm of daily life, bicycles creaking along cobblestones, merchants arranging fruits and vegetables in baskets, and the occasional car rumbling past. The ocean beyond the harbor sparkled, reflecting the rising sun, while palm trees swayed gently as if to the beat of an invisible conductor. In the offices of Pearl Harbor's Intelligence Command, a small group of officers pored over decoded messages intercepted from Japanese communications. The chatter spoke of movement in the Pacific, a naval fleet traveling under strict radio silence. Analysts debated the meaning and urgency, but there was no consensus. It could be a routine exercise, one officer suggested, though the others weren't so sure. They worked quietly, acutely aware that their efforts were pieces of a puzzle too vast to see in entirety. Their warnings, while serious, had yet to penetrate the larger harbor. Meanwhile, Harrington returned to the deck of the USS Arizona, adjusting his cap as he surveyed the harbor. The air smelled of salt and diesel, a scent that had become comfortingly familiar over years of service. Sailors climbed the rigging, maintaining equipment, their movements precise and practiced. Seagulls wheeled above, gliding on the updrafts of warm air, their cries piercing the gentle morning stillness. Everything at this moment was ordinary. Ordinary enough to lull the heart into complacency, ordinary enough to make what was coming all the more shocking. The calmness was punctuated by mundane details that now, in retrospect, became haunting markers of history. A small boy ran along the pier, his laughter echoing over the water as he kicked a tin can. A ship's cook carried a tray of coffee and donuts to the officers' mess, balancing carefully over wet deck boards. Sailors on watch glanced lazily at the horizon, noting only the distant glimmer of sunlight on waves. The harbor was a stage, each person playing their role in a day that would soon be unrecognizable. Harrington paused at the railing, letting his gaze drift to the mountains rising beyond the island. The volcanic slopes, shrouded in mist, seemed timeless, indifferent to the lives below. He could not know that within hours, fire, smoke, and thunder would rend this serenity. Within hours, the laughter of children and the rhythmic songs of seagulls would be drowned by the roar of engines and the screams of men facing mortal danger. Yet, as he breathed in the crisp morning air, nothing betrayed the coming catastrophe. Across the harbor, on the USS Oklahoma, sailors were performing drill exercises. Their voices shouted commands, drills repeated with mechanical efficiency. On shore, a fisherman prepared his small boat for a morning on the reef. All around Pearl Harbor, the ordinary scenes of Sunday life persisted, oblivious to the approaching storm. This juxtaposition, tranquil daily life against the looming threat, created a tension that would soon snap violently, propelling the world into history. By mid-morning, the harbor was alive with light, routine, and the unspoken rhythm of military life. Harrington, standing tall on the USS Arizona, looked at his crew with a mixture of pride and fond familiarity. Each man seemed to embody a moment suspended in time, a snapshot of peace that would not last. And indeed, unbeknownst to all, that peaceful morning was the final calm before the storm, a storm that would forever etch December 7th, 1941, into the annals of history as a day that began like any other, only to end in fire, chaos, and the shock of Pearl Harbor. The first warning came as a distant hum, almost imperceptible against the calm of the morning. Sailors on the USS Arizona glanced toward the horizon, squinting at the glimmer of sunlight on the water. Lieutenant James Harrington felt a twinge of unease. Something about the way the air vibrated, the almost imperceptible tension in the crew's movements, made his stomach tighten. Within moments, that uneasy feeling exploded into horror. At exactly 7:55 a.m., the sky above Pearl Harbor erupted with a fleet of Japanese aircraft. Torpedo planes, dive bombers, and fighter escorts descended in perfect formation, their engines screaming a metallic warning. Harrington's heart pounded as he watched the first wave of planes release bombs toward the ships moored below. The tranquility of the harbor shattered instantly. Explosions ripped through the USS Oklahoma and USS Arizona, twisting steel like paper and sending columns of smoke and fire into the sky. The air filled with a metallic scent, smoke, burning fuel, and the unmistakable stench of scorched steel. Sailors screamed and shouted orders, their voices competing with the deafening roar of the attacking planes. Harrington sprinted across the deck of the Arizona, dodging debris and fallen rigging, his training taking over despite the chaos. A torpedo slammed into the port side, sending the deck tilting violently beneath his feet. Men fell into the smoke-filled air, some clutching shrapnel wounds, others scrambling to save comrades trapped by fallen beams. The world had transformed from calm routine to absolute chaos in a matter of seconds. Above the harbor, dive bombers released their payloads on battleships and airfields alike. Hangars ignited in towering infernos as bombs pierced roofs, setting fuel and ammunition ablaze. Harrington's gaze swept over the scene. The USS Nevada attempted to maneuver but was hit repeatedly, sending plumes of black smoke into the sky. Planes strafed sailors and civilians alike, their machine guns cutting through the air with deadly precision. The distant mountains of Oahu, once serene and majestic, now framed a landscape of fire, smoke, and screaming men. Amid the destruction, the crew of the USS Arizona fought desperately. Harrington reached the gun deck, barking orders as sailors manned anti-aircraft guns. Flashes of gunfire erupted toward the sky, some shots striking enemy planes, while others missed, swallowed by the chaos. Explosions sent metal fragments flying, and the roar of shells and torpedoes became an almost constant wall of sound. Sailors shielded their faces as the deck quaked under the relentless assault, yet they continued to fight, driven by training, fear, and the instinct to survive. Civilians on the shores of Honolulu were thrown into panic. Women and children ran blindly from the docks as smoke and fire filled the air. Streets became clogged with abandoned vehicles, bicycles left in haste, and families searching frantically for loved ones. Harrington's own mind raced with worry not only for his crew, but for the civilians he knew were within reach of the bombardment. From the observation deck, he saw small boats overturned and burning debris floating across the harbor, reminders of the scale of devastation. The USS Arizona, his home and responsibility, shuddered under repeated hits. One bomb struck the forward magazine, triggering a massive secondary explosion that lifted the ship violently, flames and smoke shooting hundreds of feet into the air. Harrington was thrown to the deck, ears ringing, eyes stinging from the smoke. Men around him screamed and cried for help, some injured, others stunned by the sudden violence. He pulled himself upright, heart hammering, and began helping a sailor trapped under a collapsed piece of the superstructure. Around them, the fire continued to spread, consuming everything in its path with terrifying speed. Everywhere Harrington looked, heroism and panic collided. A young sailor, barely 17, ran through a corridor filled with smoke to fire a small anti-aircraft gun despite being burned by debris. A medic, ignoring his own injuries, dragged wounded men toward makeshift triage areas, shouting reassurances even as the world around him crumbled. Harrington himself found moments of clarity amid the chaos, giving orders, directing men to safety, and witnessing acts of bravery that would echo in memory long after the smoke cleared. The Japanese planes swept in waves, each more coordinated and devastating than the last. Torpedoes sliced through the water, hitting ships with surgical precision. Dive bombers released payloads that exploded on decks, sending flames high into the air. Anti-aircraft fire, though relentless, was often ineffective against the surprise and skill of the attackers. Harrington noticed a group of sailors struggling to get a damaged ship moving, the hull already breached, yet they refused to abandon it, their determination a flickering flame of hope amidst destruction. Smoke thickened across the harbor, reducing visibility to mere feet. Harrington coughed, blinking against the haze, but pressed on. He helped a wounded officer climb to a safer part of the deck and shouted instructions over the roar of engines, explosions, and screams. Time seemed fractured, minutes stretched into eternity as the relentless assault continued. In the distance, the USS Oklahoma capsized, its crew trapped inside, and Harrington felt a deep, chilling awareness that death was everywhere, indiscriminate and sudden. Planes strafed the runways and airfields beyond the harbor, destroying dozens of aircraft on the ground. Hangars burned like massive torches, and ammunition depots exploded in violent succession. Harrington's mind raced with the impossible, the strategic planning, the sheer audacity of the attack, but there was no time to dwell on analysis. Survival, protecting others, and maintaining some semblance of order became the singular focus. By the time the first wave of planes had passed, the harbor was unrecognizable. Fires raged uncontrollably, thick black smoke curling toward the heavens. Ships lay burning, sinking, or capsized. Men ran across decks, over debris, or dove into the water to escape flames and bombs. Harrington, his uniform torn and face streaked with soot, paused atop the USS Arizona, surveying the devastation. He felt exhaustion, fear, and disbelief, yet also a strange clarity, the realization that the day would be remembered forever, a moment etched into history as the shock of Pearl Harbor. Even in retreat, the Japanese planes left behind a haunting silence, broken only by the crackle of fires and the groans of the injured. Harrington helped pull sailors from the water, dragging them toward temporary safety on the surviving parts of the deck. Around him, men prayed, shouted, or collapsed, each processing the horror in their own way. The peaceful morning had been obliterated in less than an hour, replaced by a nightmare that would define a generation. As the second wave of planes began to appear on the horizon, Harrington steeled himself for what was to come. He knew the fight was far from over. The harbor, once a picture of serene military might, had become a crucible of fire, courage, and tragedy. And amid it all, he realized, humanity, its bravery, fear, and resilience would shine brightest against the backdrop of devastation. The roar of the second wave of Japanese planes had begun by mid-morning, and the smoke from the first assault hung thick over the harbor like a suffocating blanket. Lieutenant James Harrington, still on the deck of the USS Arizona, felt his lungs burn with each inhalation of acrid smoke. His hands were raw from gripping rails and pulling sailors from the chaos, but there was no time to rest. Around him, the world seemed unrecognizable. The once pristine decks were littered with fallen comrades, twisted steel, and flaming debris. The Arizona had taken a direct hit in its forward magazine during the first wave. The explosion had been catastrophic, and yet, miraculously, some pockets of the crew had survived. Harrington moved among them, shouting orders, guiding sailors towards safer parts of the ship, and helping the injured over broken beams. Blood, sweat, and smoke covered everything, and the cries of men mixed with the distant thundering of shells to create a symphony of horror. Each face he passed told a story of shock, courage, or despair. Across the harbor, similar scenes unfolded aboard other ships. The USS Oklahoma had capsized, trapping hundreds inside its hull. Rescue teams risked their lives diving into dark, rising water to pull out survivors, their own safety secondary to saving others. On the USS West Virginia, sailors fought to contain fires that threatened to spread to the fuel stores. Onshore, medics ran through smoke-filled streets, carrying the wounded to makeshift triage stations as buildings around them burned. The scale of human suffering was immense, yet acts of courage and selflessness glimmered amid the carnage. Harrington's eyes were drawn to a young sailor, barely 17, pinned beneath a fallen metal beam. The boy's face was pale, his uniform stained with soot and blood, and he was struggling to breathe. Without hesitation, Harrington heaved the beam aside, dragging the boy to safety. "You'll make it," he shouted over the roar, though both of them knew the fragility of life in this moment. Around them, explosions continued to shake the ship, sparks flying in every direction. Even as terror gripped the harbor, moments of humanity emerged. A medic with a scorched uniform refused to abandon his patients despite a nearby ammunition depot igniting in a series of violent eruptions. Another sailor risked his life to climb atop a damaged anti-aircraft turret, shooting down enemy planes even as bullets ricocheted dangerously around him. The heroism was often quiet, unnoticed amid the chaos, but each act offered a flicker of hope in a day defined by destruction. Harrington himself faced moments of moral and physical reckoning. He helped a wounded officer onto a makeshift stretcher, navigating flaming debris and collapsing walkways. Each step was measured and deliberate. Miscalculation meant death. The cries of those still trapped under wreckage haunted him, and he felt the weight of responsibility heavier with each life he tried to save. Around him, sailors screamed names of friends lost or missing, and Harrington recognized the faces of men he had trained with for years. They were gone now, consumed by fire or water, their absence an unbearable reminder of the day's violence. On the USS Arizona, the forward section of the ship had been destroyed in the initial explosion, and fires raged uncontrollably. Harrington witnessed the death of men trapped in compartments, their screams cut short by the intensity of the blast. The scene was apocalyptic. Twisted steel protruded like broken bones, smoke thickened the air to an almost solid presence, and the smell of burning fuel and human flesh clung to everything. For Harrington, each life lost was a personal wound, each rescue a narrow defiance against fate. Civilians were not spared from the horrors. Families who had been enjoying the morning on shore now ran through streets littered with burning vehicles and debris. Children clung to parents as explosions shook the ground beneath them. Harrington caught glimpses of families trapped near the docks, desperate to escape the burning harbor. He coordinated with other officers to guide survivors toward higher ground, shouting orders that sometimes went unheard over the roar of aircraft and the crackle of flames. Amid the chaos, Harrington observed the indomitable spirit of those around him. A small group of sailors managed to get a damaged ship partially operational, refusing to abandon it despite its compromised hull. Nearby, a young woman nurse led a group of civilians through a maze of smoke and debris to safety, her voice calm and authoritative even as the world fell apart around her. In these moments, Harrington saw that courage was not defined by rank or age, but by the choice to act when fear could have paralyzed them. The human toll was staggering. By the time the smoke began to clear, hundreds were dead or wounded. The USS Arizona's casualties alone numbered in the hundreds, and across the harbor, the destruction of ships and aircraft was nearly total. Harrington, exhausted and covered in soot, paused to take in the full scope of the devastation. Ships smoldered, flames licked the edges of docks, and survivors clung to floating debris or huddled on safer decks. The water, once symbol of calm and freedom, was now dotted with the remnants of what had been a vibrant naval base. The emotional weight of the day settled on Harrington like a heavy cloak. He moved among survivors, offering words of reassurance, even when he felt none himself. Each life saved felt monumental, each loss felt unbearable. The harbor, once symbol of peace and military strength, had been transformed into a crucible of survival, heroism, and sorrow. The sounds of explosions and engines had faded, replaced by moans, cries, and the crackle of remaining fires. As night approached, Harrington found a quiet moment atop the USS Arizona, surveying the wreckage. The sun, now low in the sky, cast long shadows over the burning ships, turning the harbor into a surreal painting of fire and smoke. He thought of the men he had lost, the civilians he had guided to safety, and the acts of bravery that had emerged from the chaos. Pearl Harbor would never be the same, and neither would he. The day had taken everything from him, friends, colleagues, and the illusion of safety. But it had also revealed courage and humanity in the face of unimaginable horror. In those final moments before darkness fell, Harrington understood the magnitude of what had happened. Pearl Harbor had become a symbol of loss, of sacrifice, and of the resilience of the human spirit. Each survivor carried not only scars of smoke and fire, but the memory of those who had given everything that morning. And while the city and the harbor would begin the painful process of recovery, the shock of December 7, 1941, would resonate for generations, a lesson in both the fragility and the strength of human life in the midst of war. By the time the sun began to sink behind the volcanic slopes of Oahu on December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor was unrecognizable. Thick, acrid smoke still curled into the sky from the smoldering wrecks of battleships and destroyers, while the water reflected the orange glow of burning oil, turning the harbor into a scene both surreal and nightmarish. Lieutenant James Harrington stood atop the USS Arizona, his uniform singed and stained, face streaked with soot and exhaustion. The deafening roar of explosions had faded, replaced by the low crackle of fire and the distant cries of survivors searching for missing comrades. The human cost of the attack was staggering. Over 2,400 Americans had lost their lives, with more than 1,000 wounded, many grievously. Entire crews had perished inside capsized ships or burned beyond recognition. Harrington walked along the deck, helping the last of the wounded off the ship, each step a grim reminder of the fragility of life. His heart ached for friends lost, for the sailors whose bravery had not been enough to save them, and for the civilians who had witnessed their homes and streets transformed into a battlefield. Across the harbor, the devastation was mirrored. The USS Oklahoma remained capsized, a dark silhouette against the setting sun, while the USS West Virginia and USS Nevada smoldered, listing dangerously but still afloat. Hangars, supply depots, and airfields were obliterated, leaving the island's defensive capabilities crippled. Ships that had once represented American military might now lay in ruin, scarred beyond recognition. The meticulous planning and precision of the Japanese attack had achieved its horrifying goal, to paralyze the Pacific Fleet in a single morning. Yet, amid the wreckage, sparks of resilience and courage continued to shine. Sailors, nurses, and civilians worked tirelessly to save what remained, dragging survivors from debris, patching hulls, and organizing temporary shelters for the displaced. Harrington found himself coordinating with other officers to ensure that the wounded were evacuated and accounted for, his exhaustion secondary to the urgency of the moment. Even in the face of such destruction, the human spirit refused to surrender. In Honolulu, families emerged from hiding to survey the aftermath. Streets that had been crowded with fleeing civilians now bore the scars of chaos: overturned cars, shattered windows, and buildings blackened by fire. Survivors wept openly, searching for loved ones among the wreckage, while neighbors offered water, blankets, and comfort to those in shock. The community had been shaken to its core, yet the instinct to help one another remained unbroken. The impact of Pearl Harbor rippled far beyond the island. News of the attack traveled across the Pacific and then the nation with shocking speed. Radios crackled with the grim reality: the United States had been struck in a surprise assault that destroyed much of its Pacific fleet. In living rooms across America, families huddled around speakers, unable to comprehend the scale of the devastation. Harrington thought of his own home thousands of miles away, of letters he had written to his family, and wondered if they understood the peril that had descended upon him and his crew. The attack had shattered the illusion of safety for a nation that had watched the world descend into war but had remained largely untouched until now. On December 8th, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress, delivering a speech that would echo through history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan, he declared. Across the country, Americans were galvanized by his words, anger and resolve replacing shock and disbelief. Harrington, reading the transcript of the speech later that day, felt a mixture of pride and determination. The devastation of Pearl Harbor would not remain a symbol of helplessness. It would become the catalyst for a nation at war. Back on Oahu, recovery efforts continued. Bodies were recovered from ships in the harbor, the wounded were treated in makeshift hospitals and temporary shelters for those whose homes had been destroyed. The harbor itself, once a hub of strategic power and daily activity, was cordoned off, its waters now littered with wreckage. Survivors like Harrington moved tirelessly among the chaos, documenting what remained, coordinating efforts, and ensuring that the courage and sacrifices of the morning were not forgotten. For Harrington, the attack had forever altered his perception of duty, courage, and mortality. He reflected on the sailors who had fought with unwavering bravery, the medics who had risked their lives to save the wounded, and the civilians who had helped each other despite fear and confusion. Each story of heroism, no matter how small, became part of the tapestry of memory that would define the collective understanding of Pearl Harbor. The day had been catastrophic, but it had also revealed the resilience and strength inherent in humanity, even when confronted with an unimaginable horror. By nightfall, the island was quiet, except for the distant crackle of remaining fires. The sky was streaked with smoke, and the waters of the harbor glimmered like molten silver under the moonlight. Harrington stood on the deck of the USS Arizona, staring across the ruins. In that moment, he felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. Pearl Harbor had become a monument to loss, bravery, and the awakening of a nation forced to confront the realities of global conflict. December 7th, 1941, had begun as an ordinary Sunday morning and ended as a day etched in memory, forever remembered for its shock, its tragedy, and the courage it revealed. Harrington, along with the surviving sailors, nurses, and civilians, understood that life would never return to the calm and routine of that morning. Pearl Harbor had changed everything. It had sparked not only grief, but also determination, uniting a nation and compelling it to action. As the first stars emerged over the Hawaiian sky, Harrington felt a solemn resolve settle over him. The United States had been attacked, but the spirit of its people and the bravery of those who had survived would endure. Pearl Harbor was no longer just a naval base, it was a symbol of sacrifice, a testament to courage, and the starting point of a global struggle that would define a generation. The harrowing events of the day had left scars on the landscape, on the ships, and in the hearts of those who survived, but from this devastation emerged a unified resolve, the dawn of a nation at war, unwilling to be broken and determined to prevail.